I tried to read the book at the edge of the woods, at the actual edge of the woods, and here's what happened. This novel is by Kathryn Bromwich, and it was published by $2 Radio just this summer, and it has already become one of my favorite books of 2023. It's narrated by a woman named Laura, and there are times in this novel where Laura, our narrator, sees two realities. At the beginning of the novel, Laura has recently moved into a remote cabin hidden in the forests of the Italian Alps, and it is the perfect place that she has found to hide from something dangerous in her past, and we don't know what that is when the novel opens, but we know she is hiding from something or someone. Surrounded by this alpine forest, Laura sees initially what anyone might see in this beautiful region. She sees spruce and wildflowers and streams and beautiful lakes and mountains and snow and mud and pine martens and wolves and birds. She spends most of her time alone in the cabin and hiking through the woods and on the cliffs, but she does travel from time to time to a nearby village for supplies and odd jobs, where the villagers are wary of her and a bit suspicious of her solitary lifestyle, but they're outwardly tolerant of her, at least at first. So about halfway through the novel, as Laura's isolation increases and as she comes to rely more on the land for survival and less on the village nearby for her survival, the landscape starts to change, or she starts to notice changes in the landscape. Streams seem to move or disappear entirely, lichens swirl brightly before her very eyes, trees change shape, leaves turn unusual colors. She refers to it as though I were seeing the forest through two sets of eyes. Things shimmer and shift at the edge of her vision. So we're wondering, is Laura hallucinating, or is she actually seeing double? Is she seeing the world and the forest around her in a way that is not typical for human eyes? Laura becomes captivated by her newfound connection with the land and with the plants and the animals around her. She starts to see these vast connections of life that only she seemingly is able to see. So instead of finding independence in this remote cabin of her forest home, she actually finds interdependence through these vast connections of life. But the villagers are becoming increasingly suspicious of Laura's lifestyle, and she finds that her isolation, which she sought for protection from her past, has actually turned her into a target. The blurbs for this novel compare it to Richard Powers and Atessa Moshfegh, but I was really reminded of a novel called The Wall by Marlene Haushofer that was published in 1963. The Wall is also a novel about a woman who has to survive on her own in the Alps and forms tight bonds with the animals and plants that surround her. I found that both of these novels had a lot of similarities. Even the endings of the novels have very striking similarities. But in Bromwich's novel, Laura chooses to live a life of solitude at the edge of the woods, whereas in The Wall, the narrator actually is cut off from the world by supernatural forces. And interestingly, I think it is Laura's choice of isolation in this novel that makes her seem so threatening to others. So in this way, thinking about Laura's choice to live in solitude, the novel reminds me of two other novels that I love, about two other fictional women who choose a life of solitude at the edge of the woods. In Sylvia Townsend Warner's 1926 novel Lolly Willows, Lolly, whose real name is actually Laura, interestingly, leaves her family in London to go live by herself in the countryside. And both Lolly and Laura find these deep connections with the forest and animals and plants around them. And they find that the forest is enchantingly alive and brimming with amazing life, amazing more than human life. And then in Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which was published in 2009, the narrator Janina lives in a small Polish village on the edge of the mountains in the middle of a beautiful deep forest, where she practices astrology and forms really deep connections with the animals that live around her in her rugged home. All four of these women, Laura, Lolly, Janina, and the narrator from The Wall, are seen as threats to those around them, whether they are just perceived as threats or whether they become actual real physical threats to those around them. And all four of them, none of whom have living children, are seeking a place in a world that only assigns women one of a few specific roles. What does it mean to be a childless woman living alone at the edge of the woods? Laura is at times seen as someone who needs to be protected. The villagers, the people who know her, are worried for her safety living alone at the edge of this forest. It's too dangerous for a woman to be living out there alone. But her proximity to the woods also renders her too wild for the rest of the village. She'll never be fully accepted in town because she's too close to that wild world. But then again, she'll never really be a part of that wild place either. She's right at the border between civilization and wildness. And so she becomes a kind of a protector of that border. She becomes a guardian of the forest. And the conflict of those three roles, the vulnerable woman, the wild creature, and the caretaker, is really what creates a lot of the tension in the novel. And this tension is external as Laura faces the villagers, but it's also internal as well. Laura is changed by the landscape and her relationship to it. Laura's story seemed to me both timely and outside of time. So reading At the Edge of the Woods was in fact a lot like seeing double. As I mentioned, Laura sees double in the beginning. So the year in the novel is not specified. There are no cell phones, computers, no internet, and the lush language that Bromwich uses also kind of evokes a previous century as well. Bromwich treats us to such glittering descriptions of Laura's surroundings in the forests, and those descriptions are mirrored by really deep considerations of Laura's inner life. I was not surprised at all to learn that Bromwich has lived both in Italy and in Austria. The descriptions were so vivid, and it was such a delight to read the really sumptuous details of the mountains and the forest of Laura's home, and even the meals that she eats were portrayed in such mouth-watering detail. It was beautiful. So it really felt almost like a novel that came from a previous century. But then flickering under the surface is a quality that really feels aimed at our particular moment in time in 2023. It was this like pervasive dread that Laura was looking at a world that could be washed away at any moment because of the folly of people, because of the follies of humans. So reading it was really like seeing two different worlds. It was like seeing double, or two sides of the world. But for me, whenever I read a first-person narrator, I always relate it back to the actual act of storytelling. And I felt like Laura's double vision, whether the author intended this or not, I felt like Laura's double vision hinted at the inner workings of the very art of fiction itself. Because every step of a first-person narration involves two sets of eyes. The writer must see Laura's forest while writing, so that Laura can then, as the narrator, see the forest. The writer has to see it first, or while Laura's seeing it, as the writer is writing it down. So maybe what Laura is seeing glimmering and shifting at the edges of her vision are really the possibilities that were glimmering and shifting for Bromwich as she wrote the novel, the possibilities of how to describe this beautiful forest. And then while reading, it's our eyes who are directed by Laura's eyes. We see what she sees. So she can heighten the colors of leaves for us. She can invite a peacock into her garden. She can plunge into a crystalline lake and then make that lake completely disappear. And indeed, Laura claims that she is noticing she has even greater control over this double vision as the novel progresses. So perhaps she's gaining confidence in her ability to direct our attention as readers. But we have to accept that Laura is an invention. And so in the end, the two sets of eyes can only really be the writers and the readers. For me, as I was reading these references to double vision and two sets of eyes, I felt like it was a peek behind the storytelling curtain. It was a bit of a reveal of the magic of fiction. Two pairs of eyes see a whole world, a world created by one for the other. And those two sets of eyes will never see the same thing, not exactly, but the mind behind each pair of eyes can imagine what the other may be seeing, shimmering somewhere beyond. So as I mentioned, this book was published by $2 Radio. It's one of my favorite small presses. It's based in Columbus, Ohio. One of the things I love the most about $2 Radio is you can walk into a bookstore, see a cover, and say, that looks like a $2 radio book. They're just so colorful and quirky, and I really love their books. I hope you'll check them out. So now I want to know what you've been reading lately. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you later. I'm Sarah. I don't think I said that in the beginning. I'll see you next time. Bye, folks.